Hi, my name's Ian Puddick. People know me online because I was involved in a huge police operation called Operation Bohan by the Counter-Terrorism Police. I won every single case. The police abused me in custody. I was brutalised. The CCTV was wiped. And I made a huge fuss about it and tried to hold every single officer to account, including the police commissioner. During that time, I met David Shayler. And David Shayler is a former MI5 officer. We became very good friends. He stayed with me here at my office for quite a period of time. Unfortunately, that was a joke. So we're going to do an interview with David Shayler, and it's about life inside MI5. Now, obviously, there are restrictions, the Official Secrets Act, etc. So we're not going to breach the Official Secrets Act. David wrote a book that the government initially tried to ban called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers. And it was eventually republished with some redactions. I did actually find out what the redactions were, and it's very interesting. So I'm going to do something I've never done before, and I probably, hopefully, will never do again. David has had a very difficult time. I'm not going to say any more than that. You can watch the interviews and you can make up your own mind what kind of lifestyle David has had to have, unfortunately, because of how he's been treated. So none of my YouTube channel, some of my videos have had 1.5 million views. My YouTube channel is not monetized. None of my videos are monetized. I don't make 1p from YouTube, and my plans are never to do that. However, this one video, there will be a link under the video for donations at your discretion, and every single penny will go to my good friend David Shayler. As I said, you can make up your mind. You listen to what David's got to say, listen to what's happened to him. He's a good man, he's an honest man. He told the truth and was destroyed for it. Well, not totally destroyed. So that's my introduction, and I look forward to speaking to David. So David and I have been good friends for a long time. So David, thanks for coming down to do this. We've been talking about it for probably over a year?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And have I ever let you down about this? Don't answer that. So the $1 million question. So before we get into all the really interesting stuff, just tell the audience really a bit about your life, what you did before you were in MI5.
Yeah, before MI5 I was largely a journalist and an activist. I went to university in the 80s. I took over the student newspaper at one point. But this was a time when a lot was happening with the official...
Did you ever get banned?
Very closely got banned, yes. Let me tell the story in full. I took over the student newspaper. Now, trying to get people to take a student newspaper off you is extremely difficult. You've virtually got to pay them to take it off you. But that's because most of them aren't full of news. They're full of boring reports of council meetings and that kind of thing. Whereas I did it a bit more kind of tabloid, but with a...
Page 3?
It's quite funny because I did suggest that to a girl.
That was a joke.
Not with her breasts out, obviously.
Well, of course.
Lingerie, whatever. But I did suggest things like
that
just to annoy the feminists at university at the time. Yeah, so what happened is I tried to produce things that people would want to read. And this is very important, bearing in mind that I was recruited by MI5, is that in the 1980s, when I'd been cutting my teeth in journalism, there was a book called Spy Catcher, written by a former MI5 officer called Peter Wright. And this book essentially said that MI5 had bugged and burgled its way across London.
Yeah, illegally.
Yeah.
Illegally.
Yeah, and crucially had tried to destabilise the government of Harold Wilson in the 1970s, the Labour government of Harold Wilson. Now, the Conservative government at the time, led by Thatcher, banned the book. Now, whether the contents were true or not is to me irrelevant. The fact that it was saying such important stuff, I thought it needed to go out to a wider audience.
So what years was that, roughly?
We're talking about 1988 now.
Because the whole purpose of this interview, by the time we get to the end, is to get to the issues of accountability. So there was, he clearly wrote that book at that time because there was no accountability.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And by at this point, MI5 is not even on a legal footing. It was only in the 1989 Security Service Act that meant it was legal.
That's mentioned in your book.
Yeah, and could be mentioned in Parliament. Before then, if they were mentioned in Parliament, our MPs would, were told to shut up.
And didn't Tony Benn famously go to Speaker's Corner and read extracts of the book, Spy Catcher? I'm pretty sure he did.
Well, you did, yeah. But anyway, we've got a copy of the book. And so I published the extracts, particularly about this plot against Wilson, in my student newspaper, basically.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Now, obviously, nothing. Even though I was technically breaking an injunction, which means I've been breaking injunctions for well over 30 years now, nothing was done. Obviously, you play a game, you calculate. I obviously realised if they went for it, it'd be massive publicity for me in the newspaper, yeah? And they obviously realised that as well.
What's the circulation of this student newspaper? I assume that it's tiny.
Yeah, about 1,000, something like that, yeah. But yeah, so they didn't go for me and they didn't fall into that trap. But what I do think is that someone somewhere noted something. This guy is a troublemaker who can think for himself. Now, I always say with people like that, it's better to have them inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in, basically. So when you talk about me being recruited by MI5, this is what I think is the explanation of it, because there's no real reason why MI5 should go for somebody who's been a journalist and an activist. I had also run my own business. I ran a student newspaper.
I mean, I know you well, don't I, David? I have no idea how they recruited you or why they recruited you, even now.
Yeah. Well, people ask that question as well, but they were at the time, in the early 90s, by the time it came around to recruitment, they were looking for people from different backgrounds.
It was the Old Boys Network.
Up until that point,
sure.
yeah. And even though I came from, was bred to grammar school, middle class, Beaconsfield and so on, we were kind of lower class compared to what MI5 had seen in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, to give you an idea about this, MI5 officers are not paid much. They're paid 10% more than a civil servant at the same grade, even though they're doing massively more responsible work, including, say, stuff where people can die. And the reason we're shadowing the civil service and not the police, who get paid a lot more, is because when they decided this about 20 years before I joined, a lot of MI5 officers had private incomes. So the income they got from the job was just pin money, basically.
Yeah, because they're already wealthy.
Yeah. But obviously 20 years later, people like me were relying this as my main income. And I don't know how people do it now in London.
And going back to that historic, the Old Boys Club or the Old Boys Network, and ladies obviously, because there were ladies in MI5, but coming from middle to upper class backgrounds with money, was the premise behind that they got a minimal amount of money from the government, but they weren't open to blackmail because they're already quite wealthy in the first place. Yeah. Was that the reason for that?
Yeah, that kind of mentality. Also the fact that they wanted, in those days the world was very different. Britain changed massively after the war in the 1970s. So it was much more the idea of people with family contacts they could trust and so on. Sometimes it would be the son of a special branch officer, something like that, or somebody who'd been in the services for years. And let's make it clear, MI6 still operates like that as far as I'm aware. Certainly when I was there, and I've seen nothing to see this change since then, and it's largely a family affair. And that means that people can't blow the whistle, because they're not just rejecting their employer, they're rejecting their entire social and familial situation. So it's a good way of keeping people under control. But to just get a bit more about my background, I had worked for the Sunday Times. I went straight from college to the Sunday Times. I was the only non-Oxbridge person to do that.
Was that under Andrew Neil?
Yeah, I met Andrew Neil my first day. Yeah.
Because the Sunday Times, and if I'm wrong on this, obviously I'll message Andrew and Andrew can correct me, because obviously I wouldn't intentionally want to say something that was incorrect. But I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that when Spycatcher came out, the Sunday Times published extracts of that book, and the Thatcher government threatened to injunct obviously the Sunday Times and actually put Andrew Neil in prison, and he printed, good for Andrew Neil, and obviously he's probably one of the few real journalists that we've got left that will stand up to authority and power and doesn't care and does the right thing.
Yeah, no, this is true. They had printed the extracts from Spycatcher, but then they weren't allowed to repeat them because of the injunction. But you're right, in the 1980s...
A lot of journalists would have crumbled and just not done it.
Yeah.
But Andrew obviously didn't.
But we've got all sorts of examples, say, from the 80s and 90s, where journalists did actually stand up to government. Even in my own case, I'll just very quickly mention this now, that BBC Panorama, they tried to ban an interview with me where I talked about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. And the BBC stood up to them. But that wouldn't happen anymore.
No way.
In my background, I worked for the Sunday Times. I met Andrew Neil when I was working there. I thought it was going to be a kind of a training. I could go and apply my trade anywhere for life. But it turned out it wasn't. It was just a slave labour scheme. So after being sacked by the Sunday Times, I ran my own newspaper, going out to students in Scotland for a bit. That went down the recession in the early 90s.
What was the reason you chose journalism? Why did you want to do journalism?
I've always been interested in writing, and making writing pay is always quite difficult.
Hard, I'd imagine extremely hard.
Yeah, journalism is possibly the best way of doing that. It certainly was in those days, and certainly say you could maintain a certain amount of integrity. I don't think you could anymore working on the mainstream media. Quite funnily as well, I've told my father, whose background is entirely in science and didn't go to university, that when I told him I wanted to do English literature, what are you going to do with that? I said, first thing that came from that was journalist. All I could think of. All right then. You didn't know you don't have to have a degree in English literature to be a journalist. But then I think he thought that I was really far-sighted and ambitious, because ultimately I did become a journalist, a complete accident. I got into journalism principally on the student newspaper to write better arts reviews. Everybody on the student newspaper wants to write the cinema review, the theatre review, the band reviews.
The fun stuff.
Exactly, yeah. But the people who write it often don't have any quality of writing. And I began by writing those kind of reviews. My first review I ever did was the original Back to the Future cinema review, would you believe, from the 80s, about 86. And then I became the arts editor. And I was getting the arts pages in shape, and then the editor of the newspaper resigned. And say, if I'd gone to somewhere like Oxford, there's no way this would have happened, because there'd be lots of ambitious people all editing the newspaper. But in a small concern like in Dundee, nobody wanted to be editor. It was a poisoned chalice. So I kind of stuck my hand up and said, look, I'll give it a go. And to give you the idea at the time, I was such a drinker that people laughed. They really did laugh at me. At the same time, I wanted to get my life sorted out. I realised I was drinking too much and things like this. So I just thought, right, I'm going to stop drinking and apply myself to this thing and see if I can do it.
So because you don't even drink now, do you? That's lemonade.
Yeah, no, I had about 12, 13 years where I could say I drank for England. I was a World Cup drinker, basically. Yeah. Even holding down jobs, I was one of those people that could do it.
The journalists all seem to be able to do that.
Yeah. And intelligence officers, another heavy drinking profession. So, but by the time I got 30, I thought I'd have my fill of alcohol, and that was that. But say at the time I was drinking a lot, but I gave it all up for this newspaper. I had a very strict rule that once I'd started to doing an issue, I wouldn't drink until they had it put to bed 2.5 weeks later, basically.
And then you'd make up for it?
Yeah.
Okay. Some things never change.
Obviously, I published extracts of Spycatcher when it was under injunction. That had very little effect, really. I thought we'd have massive people picking out wanting to read it.
Yeah.
But what happened about 6 months later...
Was that due to lack of marketing, that people didn't know it was in the student magazine? Because people didn't know about the student magazine?
Well, we tried as hard as we could with it, with
sure.
posts and stuff like that, very difficult. But we actually managed to find the solution eventually was... we actually managed to get a photographer into the medical students' initiation ceremony. And not only did we get a photographer in, we gave the photographs to the Sun and the Daily Record in Scotland.
Was it raucous?
Well, this is it. It was raucous. It was like naked medical students. Ironically, some of them were strapped to crucifixes. They shoved a pole up a guy's arse. They'd had women with wet T-shirts on and covered them in baked beans and things like that, and men eating the baked beans off. And obviously it was quite traumatic for people first coming to university, so there was a public interest in this.
Especially the bloke with a pole up his bum.
Well, I had spoken to a lot of medical students who were very anxious about this ceremony. You say even in Scotland as well, they go earlier sometimes. They go at the age of 17, so they're not even real adults. So there was a serious story to this as well as all the other stuff. Now, when it appeared on the front page of our student newspaper, it had an opposite effect with medics. They're all buying it and showing their mates, oh, it'll be great. But anyway, we gave the story to the Sun, the Daily Record. The Daily Record has penetration like no other newspaper in the world. Yeah, so it goes out all over Scotland. And I remember I used to actually live in the newspaper office as well. This is how devoted I was. So one morning, my girlfriend comes down, hammering on the door. I open the door and she goes, Dave, you've got to get up. I said, why? She said, the Sun and the Record have sold out in every single newsagents in Dundee, and they're bussing in 200 more copies to each newsagent of each one, and we've sold out the student newspaper in the shop. You've got to get up and get some more copies in there. So finally we had some success with this story.
Fantastic.
Basically, but at the same time the university had an inquiry, half-baked inquiry, tried to blame us, didn't take any action against the medical students.
Now, so hang on, so this is a thing, a recurring thing. So you were the bad guy for exposing the bad behaviour. The bad behaviour was acceptable, but you were the baddie for telling people about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now,
so nothing's changed. Nothing changed.
The Vice Chancellor of the University didn't know that the President of the Union was a friend of mine, so he said to the President of the Union, I want this guy out. So the President came straight down and told me, and that was when I did my first ever media interview with Radio Tay, saying, the Vice Chancellor wants to be kicked out for this, don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah.
So that was my first thing. But also it was
and how did you win on that? Did they get you out or?
No, they didn't. I went to the English department, they all supported me, they were all big fans of the newspaper, like what I'd done with it and everything.
Yeah, that's good.
So they weren't going to be able
I didn't know that about you, that's good.
Yeah. But this is what people have got to realise in life. You've got to know the strength of your own hand, and this is what people don't have often. They'll be bluffed out of their own hand. It was a bit like people saying to me, well, why did you only get 6 months when you were finally put on trial?
Yeah.
And that's because I've gone around the country.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
But just to quickly say here, that's because I've gone around the country telling people about my situation, so they would have a political prisoner on their hands. At the time they're trying to go into Iraq, they don't want to be fighting on both those fronts. So you've got to know the strength of your own hand. And obviously everything went crazy. I say people in the newspaper were beaten up because of this story about the medical students, half-baked inquiry. But in that respect, it was like a dry run. I'm a believer, and I believe that even though I was an atheist at that point, God put me through a dry run for blowing the whistle 10 years later.
Okay, we're not going to spend any of that stuff.
No. That's what I was doing. I was going through a dry run for that. It's the same sort of thing. What happens when you essentially hit authority on the nose? They don't like it.
No.
And they will,
as Jonesy from Dad's Army would say, they don't like it up them.
They don't like it up them. They don't like it up them. Yeah. So we'd had some success with the newspaper because of that, and that's why I got on the Sunday Times.
And where did after that? Where did you go? After that, so after the student newspaper, did you go directly into MI5 from there, or did you have other jobs?
No, it's just, after the University Sunday Times,
yeah,
that lasted about 7 months. I then ran my own newspaper for a year
yeah.
in Scotland, and then after that, I was looking for other jobs in journalism.
Okay, so this is it.
Yeah, so I read the Independent at the time, and I'm looking through the section, the jobs.
Is the Independent newspaper independent?
It was more so then.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Because I remember when that newspaper, as a golden oldie, I remember when that newspaper first came out. The advert showed an elderly. This is on TV, cinemas. It showed an elderly lady walking on the pavement under some scaffolding, and this big, huge, thuggish guy running over and grabbing her. And it looked like he was just about to mug her. It was absolutely apparent the guy's going to mug her, he's going to grab her bag. And then they showed the same video from a different perspective, and some scaffolding was about to fall, and he was saving her. And it just says, life isn't black and white. The advert went, life isn't black and white, there are different perspectives, we try to cover all, we're independent, are you? And I just thought that was great. But obviously, like all things, that's all gone.
Yeah, it's all gone, yeah.
But
it was a prestigious newspaper at the time.
Good.
Definitely. Yeah.
Is it Eddie Shah that ran it? I can't remember.
It wasn't Eddie Shah, he was Today, wasn't he?
It was Today, yeah.